Across the galaxy, every species knows the same truth. Humans always sit first in any council chamber, meeting room, or diplomatic gathering. It's not protocol. It's not written in any treaty. It's not even discussed. The Zephyrians, with their crystalline minds that can process 1,000 scenarios per second, wait for humans to choose their seats. The Karathi Empire, conquerors of 17 star systems, defer to human seating arrangements without question. Even the ancient ethereal collective, beings of pure energy who have witnessed the birth and death of stars, pause until the humans have settled themselves comfortably. Ask any alien diplomat why this happens, and you'll get nervous laughter, awkward silence, or a quick change of subject. The few brave enough to speak will whisper the same phrase. You don't understand what happens when humans don't sit first. But Dr. Sarah Chun, humanity's newest diplomatic attaché, is about to discover that some secrets are kept for very good reasons. And some traditions exist because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. The truth behind humanity's seating privilege isn't about respect, diplomacy, or ancient agreements. It's about survival. And when Sarah accidentally breaks this unspoken rule during the most important peace summit in galactic history, she's about to learn why every species in the galaxy fears what humans become when they have to stand and wait. Dr. Sarah Chun adjusted her diplomatic uniform for the 10th time as the transport shuttle descended toward the massive space station orbiting Nexus Prime. Through the viewport, she could see the gleaming structure that housed the Galactic Council, its spiral arms stretching out like a metallic galaxy in miniature. Each arm represented a different species, their architectural preferences blending into a harmonious yet alien design that never failed to take her breath away. First time in a major council meeting, asked Ambassador Rodriguez from the seat across from her. The older man had been humanity's chief diplomatic representative for over 2 decades, his weathered face bearing the subtle marks of countless negotiations with species that could kill him with a thought. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, trying to keep the nervous excitement from her voice. "I've studied the protocols extensively, reviewed all the major treaties, and I've been briefed on the cultural sensitivities of each species we'll be meeting with." Rodriguez smiled, but there was something in his expression that seemed almost sad. "Book learning is important, Dr. Chun, but there are some things you can only understand through experience. Today, you're going to see why humanity holds such a unique position in galactic politics." The shuttle docked with a soft thud, and Sarah gathered her materials. The peace summit they were attending would determine the fate of 3 contested star systems, with tensions running high between the militaristic Karathi Empire and the technologically advanced Zephyrian Collective. Humanity had been chosen as the neutral mediator, despite being one of the youngest species in the galactic community. As they walked through the station's corridors, Sarah noticed how other beings seemed to give them a wide berth. A group of tall, insectoid Mantari diplomats actually stepped into an alcove to let them pass, their compound eyes tracking every movement. A Karathi warrior, easily 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and natural armor plating, pressed himself against the wall as they approached. "Ambassador," Sarah whispered, "why is everyone acting so deferential? I thought humans were considered a minor species in galactic politics." "We are," Rodriguez replied quietly. "That's what makes it so interesting." They reached the council chamber doors, massive barriers of some translucent material that seemed to shimmer with inner light. Rodriguez paused, his hand on the control panel. "Sarah, I need you to remember something very important. When we enter that chamber, no matter what happens, no matter how confused or curious you get, you let me sit first. You don't question it, you don't delay, and you absolutely do not sit before me or any other human delegate. Do you understand?" Sarah frowned. "I don't understand the significance, sir, but yes, I'll follow your lead." "Good." Rodriguez activated the doors, and they slid open to reveal the vast circular chamber beyond. The council chamber was a marvel of engineering, with tiered seating arranged in concentric circles around a central speaking platform. Representatives from dozens of species were already present, their diverse forms creating a living rainbow of galactic diversity. Sarah recognized most of them from her studies. The ethereal, almost translucent veil dancers floating in their specialized atmospheric pods. The rocky, mountain-like granite lords who communicated through subsonic vibrations. The sleek Aquatic Federation members in their mobility suits filled with their homeworld's ammonia-based atmosphere. What struck her immediately was the silence. Dozens of the galaxy's most powerful beings, many of whom were natural enemies, sat in complete quiet, all facing toward the human seating section. It was as if they were waiting for something. Rodriguez walked confidently down the steps toward the human delegation's assigned area. As he moved, Sarah noticed a subtle shift in the chamber's atmosphere. The tension that had been barely perceptible became more focused, more intense. Every eye, sensor, and psychic awareness in the room was tracking their movement. The human seating section was positioned in what Sarah had assumed was a place of honor, directly across from the central speaking platform with an unobstructed view of all other delegations. Rodriguez approached the first chair in their section, paused for just a moment, then sat down with deliberate, unhurried movements. The effect was instantaneous. The entire chamber seemed to exhale collectively, a wave of what could only be described as relief washing over the assembled delegates. Conversations began in dozens of languages and communication methods, the normal bustle of a diplomatic gathering finally commencing. Sarah took the seat next to Rodriguez, her mind racing with questions. "Sir, what just happened? Why was everyone waiting for you to sit?" Before Rodriguez could answer, a new voice interrupted them. "Ambassador Rodriguez, welcome back to Nexus Prime." The speaker was a Zephyrian, her crystalline skin refracting the chamber's lights into prismatic rainbows. Dr. Vexhai was the collective's chief negotiator and, according to Sarah's briefings, one of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. "Dr. Vexhai," Rodriguez nodded respectfully. "Thank you for the welcome. May I present Dr. Sarah Chun, our new diplomatic attaché." The Zephyrian's multifaceted eyes studied Sarah with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "Dr. Chun, your reputation precedes you. 3 degrees in xenobiology, specialization in interspecies psychology, and top of your class at the Diplomatic Academy. Impressive credentials for someone so young." "Thank you," Sarah replied, uncertain why the compliment felt more like an assessment. "I trust Ambassador Rodriguez has briefed you on our customs?" Vexhai's tone carried an undertone Sarah couldn't identify. "Dr. Chun is still learning," Rodriguez interjected smoothly. "She'll observe today's proceedings." Vexhai's crystalline features shifted in what might have been approval or concern. "Observation is wise. Understanding comes with experience." She glided away, her form moving with the fluid grace of liquid mercury. As more delegates arrived and took their seats, Sarah began to notice a pattern. No matter when they entered the chamber, every delegation waited until the humans were seated before taking their own places. The proud Karathi warriors, the ancient ethereal collective, the mysterious shadow weavers who existed partially in another dimension. All of them deferred to human seating arrangements. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered to Rodriguez. "According to every text I've read, humans are considered a junior species. We've been part of galactic society for less than a century. Why does everyone defer to us?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, watching as the last few delegations filed in. The chamber was now full, hundreds of beings representing thousands of worlds and trillions of lives. "Sarah, what do you know about human history before we reach the stars?" The question seemed oddly timed, but Sarah answered automatically. "The standard curriculum covers our technological development, the unification of Earth's governments, the first successful faster-than-light experiments, and our initial contact with galactic civilization." "And before that? Before we unified?" Sarah frowned. "Well, the usual history. Wars, empires rising and falling, technological advancement, social evolution." "Wars," Rodriguez repeated softly. "How many wars, Sarah?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure. Thousands? Tens of thousands? Human history is full of conflicts. 14,732, Rodriguez said with quiet precision. That's the number of documented military conflicts in human history, from the first organized battles to the final unification wars. 14,000 separate times that humans chose to solve problems through violence. Sarah stared at him. Sir, I don't understand the relevance. You will. Rodriguez gestured toward the assembled delegates. Look at them, Sarah. Really look at them. The Karathi Empire has been engaged in warfare for over 3,000 years, conquering system after system. The Zephyrian Collective has never lost a strategic conflict in their recorded history. The Granite Lords once moved their entire homeworld to ram it into an enemy sun. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But none of them, not a single species in this chamber, has a military history that even approaches humanity's. We didn't just fight wars, Sarah. We perfected them. We turned the art of killing into a science, and we did it while fighting ourselves. The formal opening ceremonies began, with the council's AI moderator calling the session to order. Sarah tried to focus on the proceedings, but Rodriguez's words kept echoing in her mind. Around the chamber, she began to notice subtle details she had missed before. The way other delegates' eyes would occasionally dart toward the human section with something that looked almost like fear. The careful distance maintained by species that could easily overpower humans physically. The unconscious, defensive postures of beings who could manipulate matter with their thoughts. The morning session focused on the preliminary negotiations between the Karathi and Zephyrian delegations. The disputed star systems contained rare minerals essential to both species' technologies, and neither side seemed willing to compromise. Sarah found herself impressed by the complexity of the arguments and counter-arguments, the subtle web of treaties and precedents that govern galactic law. But she also noticed something else. Whenever tensions in the chamber began to rise, whenever voices became heated or aggressive posturing began, the other delegates would glance toward the human section. It was subtle, almost unconscious, but unmistakable once she started looking for it. During the lunch recess, Sarah found herself walking alongside a delegate from the Ethereal Collective, one of the few species that communicated through direct telepathic contact. The being, known as Whisper of Stars, had requested permission to speak with her privately. Young human. The ethereal's voice resonated directly in her mind, carrying overtones of ancient wisdom and something else. Wariness? You observe much but understand little. I'm trying to learn, Sarah replied aloud, knowing the ethereal could perceive her thoughts regardless. Learning is dangerous for your species, Whisper of Stars projected. Knowledge brings change, and change in humans. The thought trailed off, accompanied by what felt like a psychic shudder. I don't understand. Why is everyone so afraid of humans? We're not the strongest species, or the most technologically advanced, or the oldest civilization. By most measures, we're barely more than children compared to the rest of the galactic community. The ethereal's form flickered, its energy patterns shifting in complex ways. Strength can be measured in many ways, young human. Physical power, technological superiority, mental capacity. These are simple measurements. But there's another kind of strength, one that your species possesses in abundance. What kind of strength? The strength to become what you need to become. Whisper of Stars projected, its mental voice carrying overtones of something that might have been sorrow. Other species adapt to their environment, but humans adapt their environment to themselves. And when that fails, they adapt themselves into something new entirely. Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the ethereal being had drifted away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The afternoon session proved even more contentious than the morning. The Karathi delegation, led by War Chief Thaxmore, was becoming increasingly aggressive in their demands. The massive warrior's four arms gestured emphatically as he spoke, his natural armor plates shifting color to display his emotional state, currently a deep, angry red. The Zephyrian Collective claims these systems based on what they call prior exploration. Thaxmore rumbled, his voice carrying the harmonics that made Korathi's speech sound like controlled thunder. But exploration without settlement, without the courage to commit blood and treasure to claiming new worlds, is meaningless. The Korathi Empire has colonized these systems, built cities, established trade routes. They are ours by right of conquest and development. Dr. Vexhai rose to respond, her crystalline form reflecting the chamber's lights in sharp, almost aggressive patterns. War Chief Thaxmore speaks of conquest as if it grants legitimacy. The collective established research stations in these systems over 2 centuries before the first Korathi scout ship entered the region. Our prior claim is documented and filed with the Galactic Registry. The Empire's recent military occupation does not supersede established law. Thaxmore's armor plates shifted to a deeper red, almost black at the edges. The collective speaks of law while hiding behind their technological shields. You send machines to claim worlds you dare not set foot upon yourselves. Where's the honor in that? Where's the commitment of blood that proves your people's dedication to these worlds? The tension in the chamber ratcheted higher. Other delegations shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah noticed that several species had begun unconsciously moving their chairs back, creating more space between themselves and the 2 arguing factions. That's when she noticed something else. Every few seconds, delegates from both sides would glance toward the human section, not at Rodriguez, who was maintaining a carefully neutral expression, but at the empty chairs around him. Sarah realized with a start that the human delegation was smaller than usual. Several regular attendees were absent due to a diplomatic mission to the Outer Rim. Your collective's research stations are automated platforms. Thaxmore continued, his voice rising. No Zephyrian has lived on these worlds. No Zephyrian has shed blood to defend them. No Zephyrian children have been born under their sons. You claim them as a scholar might claim a book by reading it once and putting it on a shelf. Vexhai's crystalline form began to resonate with a high-pitched harmonic that Sarah recognized as a sign of extreme agitation in Zephyrians. The Empire's definition of blood spilled seems to focus remarkably on the blood of others. Perhaps War Chief Thaxmore would care to explain to this assembly how many indigenous species were displaced or eliminated during the Empire's colonization of these systems. The War Chief rose to his full 8-foot height, all 4 arms spread wide in an unmistakable threat display. The strong survive, the weak are consumed. This is the way of the universe. The collective may hide behind their barriers and their laws, but nature recognizes only power. The chamber had gone dead silent. Sarah could feel the tension like a physical force pressing against her skin. Around the circular seating arrangement, she saw delegates from dozens of species preparing for what looked like an inevitable explosion of violence. That's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The human section was no longer the focus of nervous glances. Instead, every being in the chamber, predators and prey species alike, warriors and scholars, ancient civilizations and young races, was staring at the human delegates with expressions she had never seen before. They weren't looking at humans with fear or respect or wariness. They were looking at humans with hope, as if humanity was their last chance to prevent something terrible from happening. And Sarah was beginning to understand that whatever that something was, it had everything to do with why humans always sat first in council chambers. The standoff between War Chief Thaxmore and Dr. Vexhai continued for several more tense minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Sarah watched in fascination as the argument escalated, but her attention was increasingly drawn to the behavior of the other delegates. They weren't just uncomfortable, they were terrified. And their terror seemed to be focused not on the 2 arguing factions, but on the human section of the chamber. Finally, Ambassador Rodriguez stood up. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every conversation in the chamber stopped mid-sentence. Every delegate, regardless of species, turned to face him. The War Chief's threat display froze in mid-gesture, while Dr. Vexhai's crystalline resonance dropped to barely audible levels. Rodriguez didn't speak immediately. Instead, he simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the chamber with the kind of calm assessment that Sarah had learned to associate with military officers. The silence stretched on until it became almost unbearable. War Chief Thaxmore, Rodriguez finally said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Dr. Vexai, perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow tempers to cool. It wasn't a request. Despite his diplomatic phrasing, every being in the chamber understood it as a command. Thaxmore's armor plates immediately shifted from aggressive red to a more neutral brown, while Vexai's resonance dropped to almost nothing. Of course, Ambassador Rodriguez, the war chief rumbled, settling back into his seat with surprising meekness for a being who could literally tear a human apart with his bare hands. An excellent suggestion, Vexai agreed, her tone suddenly much more reasonable. The collective would welcome a brief respite to review our positions. Rodriguez nodded once and sat back down. Immediately, the tension in the chamber began to dissipate as delegates started filing out for the recess. Sarah noticed that many of them cast grateful glances toward the human section as they left. "Sir," Sarah whispered once they were relatively alone, "what just happened?" They were on the verge of violence, and you stopped it with a few words. "How is that possible?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, watching the last few delegates exit the chamber. "Sarah, I think it's time you learn some things they don't teach at the Diplomatic Academy. Walk with me." They left the council chamber and made their way through the station's corridors to a small observation deck that looked out over the vast expanse of space. Stars wheeled slowly past the viewport as the station rotated, and Sarah could see several other diplomatic vessels maintaining position nearby. "Tell me about the Karathi Empire," Rodriguez said, settling into one of the deck's chairs. Sarah sat across from him, grateful for the chance to demonstrate her knowledge. The Karathi are a warrior species that evolved from pack hunters. They've built their civilization around concepts of strength, honor, and conquest. Their empire spans 47 star systems and continues to expand through military action. They're physically powerful, technologically advanced in military applications, and have a rigid hierarchical society based on combat prowess. Good. And the Zephyrian Collective, a hive mind species with individual crystalline bodies that can link together to form larger collective intelligences. They're primarily scientists and philosophers, preferring exploration and research to conquest. They control 31 star systems, all of which were claimed through peaceful colonization. Their technology is among the most advanced in the galaxy, particularly in the areas of energy manipulation and quantum computing. Excellent. Now, based on that knowledge, what do you think would happen if those two species went to war? Sarah considered the question carefully. It would be devastating. The Karathi have superior military experience and tactics, but the Zephyrian technology would give them significant advantages. A war between them could last for decades and result in massive casualties on both sides. And what about the rest of the galactic community? Well, they'd probably be drawn into it eventually. The Karathi would likely try to recruit allies among the more militaristic species, while the Zephyrians would appeal to the research-oriented civilizations. It could split the galaxy into two opposing camps. Rodriguez nodded slowly. That's exactly right. And that's exactly what every delegate in that chamber was thinking about when those two started their territorial dispute. They were all calculating which side they'd be forced to choose, how many of their people would die, how much of their civilization would be destroyed. But you stopped it, Sarah said. They listened to you even though humanity doesn't have the military power to threaten either of them, or the technology to offer significant advantages. No, we don't, Rodriguez agreed. But we have something else. Something that every species in the galaxy has learned to respect, even if they don't fully understand it. He turned to face her directly. Sarah, what's the longest war in human history? The question seemed to come from nowhere. I'm not sure. The 100 Years' War? The Punic Wars? The answer depends on how you define war, Rodriguez said. But by most measures, it was the conflict between various human factions over control of Earth's resources and territory. It lasted, in one form or another, for approximately 3,000 years. Sarah stared at him. That's impossible. No civilization could sustain warfare for that long. Couldn't they? Rodriguez's smile was grim. Humans fought each other continuously from the development of organized agriculture until the final unification of Earth. 3 millennia of almost constant warfare, with brief periods of peace that were really just times when we were preparing for the next conflict. He gestured toward the viewport, where the lights of other ships could be seen in the distance. Every species out there has their own history of conflict, Sarah. The Karathi have been warriors for 3,000 years, but they conquered their enemies and then turned outward to expand their empire. The Zephyrian Collective had a brief civil war about 2,000 years ago, but it lasted less than 50 years before they achieved true unity. Rodriguez paused, his expression growing more serious. But humans? We fought ourselves for 3,000 years. We developed new ways to kill, new strategies, new weapons, new tactics, and we used all of them against people who shared our own world, our own species, sometimes our own families. We didn't stop fighting because we ran out of enemies. We stopped fighting because we finally learned how to live with each other. The implications of his words were starting to sink in, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the observation deck's temperature. Sir, are you saying that other species are afraid of humans because of our military history? Not afraid. Exactly, Rodriguez corrected. Wary. Respectful. They understand that humans have a perspective on conflict that no other species possesses. We know war in ways they can't comprehend, because we waged it against ourselves for millennia. He stood up and walked to the viewport, his reflection ghost-like against the stars. When War Chief Faxmore talks about the glory of conquest, every other species in that chamber hears a warrior bragging about his victories. But humans? We hear the voice of someone who has never fought an enemy that truly understood him. The Karathi conquered other species, but they never had to develop the deep, intimate knowledge of warfare that comes from fighting your own kind. And Dr. Vexhai? The Zephyrians are brilliant strategists, but their strategies are theoretical. They've never faced an enemy that could match their intelligence, adapt their tactics, or force them to evolve their approach over centuries of conflict. Their civil war was settled quickly because both sides were rational enough to see the futility of prolonged conflict. Rodriguez turned back to face her. But humans learned to wage war against humans. We developed strategies to counter our own strategies, tactics to defeat our own tactics, weapons to overcome our own defenses. We became the ultimate military opponent because we were fighting ourselves. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. That's why they defer to us. Not because they're afraid of our military power, but because they respect our understanding of conflict. Partially correct, Rodriguez said. But there's more to it than that. Tell me, Sarah, what do you think happens when humans don't sit first? The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized she was afraid to know the answer. Before Rodriguez could elaborate, their communicators chimed with an urgent message. The recess was ending early. There had been an incident between Karathi and Zephyrian security forces in one of the station's docking bays. They hurried back to the council chamber, where the atmosphere was even more tense than before. Several delegates were missing from their seats, and those who remained looked shaken. War Chief Faxmore was in deep conversation with his advisors, his armor plates cycling through various shades of red and orange. Dr. Vexhai stood near her delegation's seats, her crystalline form pulsing with rapid, agitated patterns. As they took their seats, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. There were only 3 humans in the chamber now: herself, Rodriguez, and one other junior diplomat. The rest of the human delegation was apparently dealing with the security incident. The council's AI moderator called the session back to order, but it was clear that the earlier confrontation had escalated beyond mere words. War Chief Faxmore rose to address the chamber, his bearing even more aggressive than before. Delegates of the Galactic Council, he began, his voice carrying the subsonic harmonics that indicated barely controlled rage. The Empire has just received word that Zephyrian forces have fired upon Karathi vessels in the disputed territories. 3 of our exploration ships have been destroyed, with all hands lost. Dr. Vexhai immediately rose to respond, her form now blazing with harsh, angular light patterns. The collective vehemently denies these accusations. Our defensive platforms responded to unprovoked attacks by Karathi military vessels that were attempting to establish illegal mining operations on protected worlds. Protected by whom? Faxmore roared, all 4 of his arms spread wide. By your machines? By your automated systems? You claim protection over worlds you've never set foot upon, and then you murder those who would actually live there. The argument quickly spiraled out of control, with other delegations choosing sides and adding their voices to the growing chaos. Sarah watched in horror as the careful diplomatic protocols that governed galactic society began to break down. Species that had been enemies for millennia started reverting to ancient hostilities, while others began calculating the advantages of joining one side or another in what was clearly becoming inevitable warfare. That's when Sarah noticed something that terrified her more than anything she had ever experienced. The other delegates weren't looking at the human section with hope anymore. They were looking at the 3 remaining human delegates with something much worse than fear. They were looking at them with desperation, as if 3 humans weren't enough, as if the small number of human representatives couldn't provide whatever it was that had been keeping galactic civilization stable. And Sarah was beginning to understand that whatever humans did when they didn't sit first, whatever role they played in preventing galactic chaos, it required more than just a token presence. It required enough humans to do something that she was only just beginning to comprehend, and that terrified every other species in the galaxy. Rodriguez caught her eye and nodded slightly toward the exit. But as they began to rise from their seats, War Chief Faxmore's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "Ambassador Rodriguez," he called out, his tone carrying both command and something that might have been pleading. "Surely the humans have an opinion on this matter? Your people have mediated disputes throughout the galaxy. What is your position on the Empire's rightful claims?" Every being in the chamber turned to stare at Rodriguez, and Sarah could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down like a physical force. But she also sensed something else, a kind of hungry anticipation that made her skin crawl. They weren't just asking for Rodriguez's opinion. They were asking for something much more dangerous. And Sarah was about to learn exactly what happened when humans were forced to be more than just diplomatic observers. Rodriguez remained standing for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the chamber. Sarah could feel the tension mounting with each passing second, and she noticed that several delegates had begun unconsciously moving their chairs back from the central area, as if trying to put distance between themselves and whatever was about to happen. War Chief Faxmore raises an interesting point about rightful claims, Rodriguez said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, as does Dr. Vexhai, regarding established legal precedents. However, I believe both perspectives are missing crucial elements. He began walking down toward the central speaking platform, and Sarah noticed that his movement seemed to have an almost hypnotic effect on the assembled delegates. Every eye tracked his progress, and she could swear that some of the more predatory species were unconsciously adopting defensive postures. The Empire speaks of blood spilled and lives committed to claiming new worlds, Rodriguez continued, reaching the center of the chamber. The collective speaks of prior exploration and legal documentation, but neither approach addresses the fundamental question: what happens to the indigenous life forms on these worlds during this dispute? Sarah frowned. According to her briefings, the disputed star systems contained only primitive bacterial life forms. Why would Rodriguez bring up indigenous species? War Chief Faxmore's armor plates shifted to a darker shade of red. The worlds in question contain no sentient species, only primitive microorganisms that pose no threat to colonization. Exactly, Rodriguez replied, and there was something in his tone that made Sarah's blood run cold. Primitive microorganisms, life forms that have existed for millions of years, adapting to their environment, evolving, surviving. And now, because two advanced civilizations cannot agree on proper procedure, these life forms face extinction. Dr. Vexhai's crystalline form pulsed with confusion. Ambassador Rodriguez, surely you cannot be suggesting that bacterial colonies should take precedence over the territorial rights of space-faring civilizations? I'm not suggesting anything, Rodriguez said quietly. I'm observing. And what I observe is two species so focused on their own interests that they're willing to destroy entire worlds' worth of life, primitive though it may be, without even considering alternatives. He turned to face the assembled delegates, and Sarah saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. It wasn't anger, exactly, or disappointment. It was something much more clinical, much more calculating. In human history, Rodriguez began, we had a term for conflicts like this. Wars where the destruction of the prize was considered acceptable as long as the enemy didn't get it. We called them Pyrrhic victories. The chamber had gone completely silent. Sarah noticed that even the translator systems seemed to be working overtime, struggling to convey not just Rodriguez's words, but the subtle undertones that made them so unsettling. The interesting thing about Pyrrhic victories, Rodriguez continued, is that they're often won by the side that's willing to accept the most damage to achieve their goals. The side that can endure more pain, sustain more losses, and keep fighting when any rational being would surrender. War Chief Thaxmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ambassador, the Empire has never backed down from necessary sacrifices. Oh, I'm sure you haven't, Rodriguez replied. And now Sarah could hear something in his voice that made her think of winter storms and deep ocean currents, powerful, implacable, and utterly indifferent to the concerns of those caught in their path. The Karathi Empire has an impressive military record. 47 conquered systems, dozens of defeated species, centuries of successful expansion. He paused, letting the silence stretch. But you've never fought humans. The words fell into the chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples of unease that spread through every delegation. Sarah saw delegates from species she had thought were incapable of fear begin to show signs of genuine terror. Neither have the Zephyrians, Rodriguez continued conversationally. Your collective has an excellent record of avoiding conflicts through technological superiority and strategic thinking. Very efficient, very rational. Dr. Vexhai's crystalline form had dimmed to barely visible levels, as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. But, you see, Rodriguez said, beginning to pace slowly around the central platform, humans have fought humans for 3,000 years. And in that time, we learned some very interesting things about warfare. Sarah wanted to interrupt, to ask him to stop, to demand to know what he was doing. But she found herself frozen in her seat, unable to move or speak, caught in the same spell that seemed to have paralyzed every other being in the chamber. We learned that there's no such thing as an acceptable loss if you're willing to lose everything, Rodriguez continued. We learned that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the best weapons or the strongest defenses. It's the one who refuses to quit even when quitting is the only rational choice. He stopped pacing and looked directly at War Chief Thaxmore. We learned that sometimes the only way to win a war is to make your enemy understand that you're willing to lose it. The War Chief's armor plates had shifted to a pale, sickly yellow that Sarah had never seen before. Around the chamber, she could see similar reactions, species known for their courage showing signs of panic, predators adopting submissive postures, ancient civilizations that had witnessed the rise and fall of stars beginning to tremble. Now, Rodriguez said, his voice still conversational, but carrying undertones that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to some primal part of the brain, I could offer to mediate this dispute. I could suggest compromises, propose alternative solutions, help both sides find a path that preserves their honor while achieving their essential goals. He smiled, and Sarah realized with horror that it was the same expression she had seen on the faces of human soldiers in historical documentaries. The cold, calculating smile of someone who had moved beyond normal human emotions into something much more dangerous. But that would require both sides to approach this conflict rationally, to weigh costs against benefits, to consider long-term consequences, to act like civilized beings who understand that some things are more important than winning. Rodriguez turned to face Dr. Vexhai. The problem is, I'm not entirely convinced that either the Empire or the Collective is approaching this situation rationally. The Empire is so focused on proving their strength that they're willing to destroy the very worlds they claim to want. The Collective is so concerned with legal precedent that they're prepared to sacrifice living beings, primitive though they may be, to maintain their position. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it still carried clearly to every corner of the chamber. And when rational beings start acting irrationally, sometimes the only way to restore sanity is to show them what true irrationality looks like. Sarah finally understood what she was witnessing. This wasn't diplomacy. This wasn't mediation or conflict resolution or any of the peaceful techniques she had studied at the academy. This was a human doing what humans had learned to do during 3,000 years of fighting other humans, escalating a conflict beyond the point where any rational being would want to continue it. Rodriguez was threatening to make the dispute so costly, so destructive, so utterly devastating that both sides would prefer any alternative to continued fighting. And, judging by the reactions around the chamber, every other species in the galaxy knew exactly what that meant. Of course, Rodriguez continued, his tone becoming almost friendly, there is another option. Both sides could step back from a brink. The Empire could acknowledge that conquest without regard for existing life is unacceptable. The Collective could admit that legal claims without physical commitment are insufficient. And, together, we could find a solution that preserves the primitive life forms while allowing both civilizations to achieve their essential objectives. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Finally, War Chief Faxmore spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The Empire would be willing to discuss alternative approaches to the colonization dispute. The Collective concurs, Dr. Vexhai added quickly, her crystalline form still dim with what Sarah now realized was terror. Perhaps a joint colonization effort, with protections for indigenous life forms. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Excellent. I'm sure we can work out the details to everyone's satisfaction. He returned to his seat, settling down with the same casual movements he had used earlier. But Sarah noticed that he was the only person in the chamber who looked completely relaxed. Every other delegate appeared to be struggling to recover from what they had just witnessed. As the formal negotiations resumed, with both sides suddenly much more willing to compromise, Sarah leaned over to whisper to Rodriguez. Sir, what just happened? What did you threaten them with? Rodriguez's expression was mild, almost innocent. I didn't threaten anyone, Sarah. I simply reminded them that humans have a unique perspective on conflict resolution. But they're terrified of you. Of us. Why? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, watching as the Karathi and Zephyrian delegations worked out the framework for a joint colonization agreement with unprecedented speed and cooperation. Because they remember what happened the last time someone forced humans to get actively involved in a galactic conflict, he said finally. Sarah stared at him. When was that? About 30 years ago. Before your time. Rodriguez's expression grew distant. There was a species called the Devourers, silicon-based life forms that consumed entire worlds, stripping them of all resources and leaving nothing but barren rock behind. They had been expanding through the galaxy for centuries, and no one could stop them. What happened? Rodriguez's smile was grim. Humans happened. We studied them, learned how they operated, and then we did what humans do best, which is, we became something worse. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the afternoon session concluded with both sides agreeing to a preliminary peace framework. As the delegates began filing out, she noticed that many of them nodded respectfully toward the human section, but none approached them directly. It wasn't until they were back on their transport shuttle that Sarah finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. Sir, you said humans always sit first in council chambers because of what happens when we don't. What exactly happens? Rodriguez looked out at the stars wheeling past the viewport, and his expression was that of someone remembering things he wished he could forget. When humans don't sit first, Sarah, when we're not given that position of respect and deference, when other species force us to wait or to compete for position, he trailed off, then looked directly at her. When that happens, we stop being diplomats and start being what we were for 3,000 years of human history. We become what made us the most successful predator species in Earth's history. And what's that? Rodriguez's answer was soft, but it carried the weight of millennia of human conflict. We become the thing that other predators have nightmares about. 3 weeks after the successful resolution of the Karathi-Zephyrian dispute, Sarah found herself assigned to her first solo diplomatic mission. The assignment seemed routine enough. A minor territorial disagreement between two smaller species, the crystalline hegemony and the void swimmers, over mining rights in an asteroid field. Both species were relatively peaceful, technologically advanced, and had a history of resolving disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. It should have been perfect for a newly graduated diplomat. As her shuttle approached the neutral station where the talks would be held, Sarah reviewed her briefing materials one final time. The crystalline hegemony was a silicon-based collective intelligence that shared thoughts through resonant frequencies. The void swimmers were energy beings that existed primarily in the vacuum of space, manipulating matter through controlled electromagnetic fields. Neither species had ever engaged in military conflict with anyone, and their dispute was purely economic in nature. The station itself was much smaller than the Grand Galactic Council Chamber, designed for minor diplomatic functions rather than major galactic summits. Sarah's spirits were high as she docked and made her way to the conference room. This would be her chance to prove that she could handle diplomatic responsibilities without the intimidating presence of Ambassador Rodriguez or the mysterious dynamics she had witnessed at the council. The conference room was modest but comfortable, with seating arrangements designed to accommodate both species' unique physiologies. Representatives from both sides were already present when Sarah arrived, along with a small delegation of observers from neutral species who would serve as witnesses to any agreements reached. Sarah took her assigned seat and was pleased to note that the human seating area was positioned prominently, just as it had been at the council chamber. Both delegations greeted her respectfully, and the initial discussions proceeded smoothly. The crystalline hegemony's spokesperson, a tall, geometric being whose faceted surface reflected the room's lights in complex patterns, presented their position with mathematical precision. The void swimmer's representative, a shimmering field of energy contained within a specialized projection system, offered counterarguments that were equally logical and well-reasoned. For the first few hours, Sarah felt confident that this would be a straightforward negotiation. Both sides were clearly intelligent, rational, and genuinely interested in finding a mutually beneficial solution. She offered several suggestions for compromise that were received positively, and by the lunch recess, she was optimistic about reaching a quick resolution. That confidence lasted until the afternoon session, when everything went wrong. The problem began with what should have been a minor procedural issue. A third party had submitted a claim to the disputed asteroid field, a previously unknown species calling themselves the entropy cult. According to galactic law, all existing negotiations had to be suspended until the new claim could be evaluated. Sarah had dealt with similar situations in her training simulations. The standard procedure was to schedule a separate hearing for the new claimants, evaluate their legal standing, and then either dismiss their claim or incorporate them into the existing negotiations. It should have taken a few days at most. But the entropy cult's representatives arrived at the station that afternoon, and Sarah realized immediately that this was unlike any diplomatic situation she had studied. The entropy cult weren't just another species with a territorial claim. They were something fundamentally different something that challenged the basic assumptions of galactic civilization. Their representatives appeared to be ordinary humanoids at first glance, but Sarah quickly noticed unsettling details. Their movements were too fluid, too precise, as if they were performing some complex dance that she couldn't quite perceive. Their speech patterns were normal, but the content of their words seemed to carry meanings that shifted depending on how she listened to them. More disturbing was their claim itself. They didn't want mining rights to the asteroid field. They wanted to return it to its natural state of decay, a phrase that meant nothing to Sarah, but seemed to terrify both the crystalline hegemony and the void swimmers. The ordered structures that these species would impose upon the field are contrary to the fundamental nature of reality, the entropy cult's leader explained, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah feel slightly nauseous. All things tend toward dissolution, toward chaos, toward the beautiful randomness of true entropy. To force artificial order upon these asteroids would be an act of cosmic violence. The crystalline hegemony's representative began resonating at frequencies that Sarah's briefing materials identified as extreme distress. The cult speaks of dissolution and chaos as if they were desirable states. This is contrary to the basic principles that govern civilized society. Civilized society is an aberration, the entropy cult leader replied calmly. A temporary clustering of order that will inevitably return to its natural state of chaos. We simply seek to accelerate that return, to spare the universe the pain of prolonged artificial organization. Sarah felt a chill as the implications of those words sank in. This wasn't a normal territorial dispute. The entropy cult wasn't interested in using the asteroid field. They wanted to destroy it entirely, to reduce organized matter back to random particles floating in space. The void swimmers' representative, already difficult to understand due to their energy-based communication method, became almost incomprehensible as their electromagnetic patterns fluctuated wildly. Sarah's translation system struggled to keep up, but she caught fragments that sounded like protests against fundamental violations of reality and threats to the basic order of existence. That's when Sarah made her first crucial mistake. She tried to mediate the dispute using standard diplomatic protocols. Perhaps we could find a compromise, she suggested, her voice sounding thin and uncertain in the face of the growing tension. The asteroid field is quite large. Could different sections be allocated for different purposes? Mining in some areas, natural preservation in others. The entropy cult leader turned to look at Sarah directly, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. The being's eyes weren't quite right. They seemed to contain depths that shouldn't have been possible in a physical structure. Young human, the cult leader said, and her voice carried overtones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You speak of compromise as if order and chaos could coexist peacefully. But entropy is not a negotiation. It is the fundamental force that drives all change, all transformation, all eventual dissolution. You cannot compromise with the heat death of the universe. Sarah stared at her, unable to formulate a response. This was completely outside anything she had been trained for. The entropy cult wasn't just another species with different cultural values. They seemed to represent something that challenged the basic assumptions of organized civilization. The negotiations continued for several more hours, but it quickly became clear that no standard diplomatic solution would work. The crystalline hegemony and void swimmers wanted to create order and structure. The entropy cult wanted to accelerate decay and dissolution. There was no middle ground, no compromise position that could satisfy both sides. As the day wore on, Sarah began to notice changes in the other delegates. The observer species, who had started the day as neutral witnesses, were becoming increasingly agitated. Several had requested permission to leave the station entirely. Others had begun sending urgent communications to their home governments. By evening, Sarah realized she was facing the first true diplomatic crisis of her career, and she had no idea how to resolve it. That's when she made her second crucial mistake. She called Ambassador Rodriguez for guidance. The transmission took several minutes to connect, and When Rodriguez's face appeared on her private communication screen, she could see immediately that something was wrong. His expression was grim, and there were other people moving urgently in the background behind him. "Sarah," he said without preamble, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Under no circumstances are you to continue negotiations with the entropy cult representatives." "Sir, I don't understand. They have a legitimate legal claim under galactic law." "Sarah," Rodriguez interrupted, his voice carrying an edge she had never heard before. "The entropy cult isn't just another species with different values. There's something much more dangerous. They're what remains of a civilization that decided to weaponize entropy itself." The words hit her like a physical blow. Weaponize entropy? What does that mean? It means they've found ways to accelerate the natural decay of organized matter. They can turn planets into asteroid fields into cosmic dust, and cosmic dust into random energy patterns. They don't want to mine those asteroids. Sarah, they want to demonstrate their capabilities by dissolving them entirely. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. But why? What do they gain from destruction? Nothing, Rodriguez replied grimly. That's what makes them so dangerous. They don't want territory, resources, power, or wealth. They want to prove that all organized existence is meaningless by returning it to chaos. And they're willing to start galactic wars to make that point. Sir, what should I do? The negotiations are scheduled to resume tomorrow morning. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear urgent conversations happening in the background. Finally, he looked back at the screen. Sarah, I need you to do something that goes against everything you were taught at the Diplomatic Academy. I need you to abandon the negotiations entirely. Get on your shuttle and leave the station immediately. But, sir, that would be a complete violation of diplomatic protocol. We can't just abandon our responsibilities. Sarah, Rodriguez said, his voice suddenly very soft. Do you remember what I told you about what happens when humans don't sit first? The memory hit her like ice water. You said we become the thing that other predators have nightmares about. That's right. And right now, every major military power in the galaxy is mobilizing their fleets. Not to fight each other, Sarah, to prevent humans from having to deal with the entropy cult directly. Sarah stared at him in confusion. I don't understand. We're just one species among hundreds. Why would anyone mobilize their fleets to prevent human involvement? Rodriguez's expression was that of someone delivering a death sentence. Because the last time humans had to deal with an existential threat to galactic civilization, we didn't just defeat our enemies, Sarah. We made them extinct. Every single individual, every colony, every trace of their existence gone. The Devourers, she whispered. The Devourers were silicon-based life, forms that consumed entire worlds. They had been expanding through the galaxy for over 1,000 years, and no one could stop them. They were essentially unstoppable until they made the mistake of attacking human colonies. Rodriguez paused, his expression growing distant. We studied them for exactly 37 days. Then, we engineered a virus that turned their silicon-based biology against itself. Within 6 months, every devourer in the galaxy was dead. Not defeated, not driven away, extinct. Sarah felt her blood turning to ice. Sir, are you saying that if I can't resolve this situation diplomatically? I'm saying that if the entropy cult starts demonstrating their capabilities, if they begin actually dissolving organized matter on a large scale, the galactic community will have no choice but to ask humans to solve the problem permanently. The implications hit her all at once. This wasn't just a failed diplomatic mission. This was potentially the trigger for the kind of conflict that could reshape galactic civilization entirely. Sir, I have to try. I can't just abandon the negotiations. There has to be a diplomatic solution. Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. Sarah, I admire your optimism, but some problems can't be solved with diplomacy. Some threats are so fundamental, so existential, that the only response is complete elimination. The transmission ended, leaving Sarah alone in her quarters with the weight of an entire galaxy's future resting on her shoulders. And tomorrow morning, She would have to sit across from beings who wanted to dissolve reality itself and somehow find a way to preserve peace without becoming the kind of monster that other species feared more than extinction itself. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Instead, she spent the dark hours poring over every piece of information she could find about the entropy cult, the failed negotiations, and the growing crisis that seemed to be spiraling beyond anyone's control. Her research painted an increasingly terrifying picture of a species that had somehow transcended normal biological limitations and transformed themselves into living weapons against the concept of order itself. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would not abandon the negotiations. She would not flee the station. And she would not allow the situation to escalate to the point where the galactic community would feel compelled to unleash whatever terrible capabilities humans possessed when pushed to their limits. The morning session began with an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Several of the observer delegations had indeed departed during the night, and those who remained looked as if they were preparing for the end of the world. The crystalline hegemony's representative was resonating at such low frequencies that the conference room's structure groaned under the stress. The void swimmers had begun fluctuating between their normal energy patterns and something much more chaotic, as if the mere presence of the entropy cult was affecting their fundamental stability. But it was the entropy cult's leader who commanded Sarah's attention. Overnight, the being had somehow changed. She still appeared humanoid, but there was something fundamentally wrong with her existence now. She seemed to occupy space differently, as if she existed partially in dimensions that Sarah couldn't perceive. When she moved, reality seemed to ripple around her like disturbed water. "Young human," the cult leader said as Sarah took her seat, "I sense you have been researching our nature. What have you learned?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "I've learned that your people have made choices that most species would consider unthinkable. You've deliberately accelerated your own entropy, transformed yourselves into something that exists at the intersection of order and chaos." "An interesting perspective," the cult leader replied, and when she smiled, Sarah caught glimpses of the void between stars. "But you still think in terms of choice, as if our transformation was a decision rather than an enlightenment. We have not chosen chaos. We have simply recognized that chaos is the only truth." The crystalline hegemony's representative attempted to interject, but their resonance patterns were so distorted by fear that the translation system couldn't make sense of their communication. "Let me ask you something," Sarah said, ignoring the protocol violations and addressing the cult leader directly. "If entropy is the only truth, if all organization is meaningless, then why are you here? Why negotiate at all? Why not simply begin dissolving the asteroid field and let the galaxy respond however it chooses?" The question seemed to amuse the cult leader. "Because entropy is not merely destruction, young human. It is transformation. The goal is not to eliminate order, but to demonstrate its fundamental impermanence. Your species, more than any other, should understand this concept." "What do you mean?" "Humans are perhaps the most entropic species in the galaxy," the cult leader explained, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's vision blur at the edges. "You transform everything you touch. You take ordered systems and remake them according to your own chaotic impulses. You wage war against yourself for millennia, creating and destroying civilizations in endless cycles." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. "You're trying to make humanity into your allies." "Not allies," the cult leader corrected. "Examples. Humans have already proven that entropy can be beautiful, that destruction can be creative, that chaos can be more productive than order. We simply wish to accelerate that natural process." The room fell silent, except for the increasingly distressed emanations from the other delegates. Sarah realized she was at the crucial moment, the point where she would either find a diplomatic solution or trigger the kind of response that would confirm every species' worst fears about humanity. That's when she remembered something Ambassador Rodriguez had said about Pyrrhic victories and the willingness to lose everything in order to win. "You're wrong," she said quietly. The simple statement seemed to surprise the cult leader. Wrong about what? Young human? You're wrong about entropy being the only truth. You're wrong about humans being naturally chaotic. And you're wrong about thinking you can force the galaxy to accept your philosophy through demonstration. Sarah stood up, and she noticed that the other delegates immediately focused their attention on her with the same intensity she had witnessed at the Galactic Council. But this time, she understood what they were looking for. They were waiting to see if she would become the kind of human that other species feared. Humans aren't entropic, Sarah continued, beginning to pace around the conference table in a pattern that unconsciously mirrored Rodriguez's movements at the council. We're adaptive. We don't create chaos. We find order within chaos and then impose that order on everything around us. The cult leader's form began to shift, becoming more solid and defined as if Sarah's words were somehow forcing her back into a more organized existence. The human species is engaged in constant warfare. Against ourselves, Sarah interrupted. We fought each other for 3,000 years not because we love destruction, but because we were learning how to create perfect order. Every war, every conflict, every battle was a test case for different organizational principles. We weren't being chaotic, we were being thorough. She stopped pacing and looked directly at the cult leader, and for the first time since the negotiations began, she felt completely in control of the situation. You want to accelerate entropy, to return organized matter to random chaos. But you're not thinking like a human. You're thinking like someone who's never had to solve the problem of how to impose order on something that doesn't want to be organized. The cult leader's form was becoming more solid by the moment, and Sarah could see what might have been confusion in her increasingly human-like features. What are you suggesting? Sarah smiled, and she realized it was the same cold, calculating expression she had seen on Rodriguez's face at the Galactic Council. I'm suggesting that if you really want to demonstrate the power of entropy, you need to do it properly. You need to show the galaxy what happens when chaos encounters something that refuses to become chaotic. The room's atmosphere changed dramatically. The other delegates, who had been preparing for the worst, suddenly began showing signs of hope mixed with terror. They were recognizing the same pattern that had played out countless times before, a human taking control of an impossible situation by making it even more impossible. You want to dissolve the asteroid field to prove your point, Sarah continued. But that's not really a demonstration. That's just destruction. Anyone can destroy things. The real question is whether you can maintain your entropy field when it encounters something that actively resists dissolution. The cult leader was now fully solid, her eyes wide with something that might have been excitement or horror. What do you mean? I mean that humans have spent 3,000 years learning how to impose order on chaotic systems. We've perfected techniques for taking random, hostile, entropic situations and forcing them into stable configurations. We've done it with ecosystems, with societies, with entire planets. Sarah leaned forward, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. So, if you really want to test the power of entropy against the power of organization, I propose we conduct a proper experiment. You try to dissolve a target that's actively defended by human organizational techniques. See which force is actually stronger, your entropy or our order. The silence that followed was absolute. The cult leader stared at Sarah with an expression of dawning realization, while the other delegates watched with a horrified fascination of beings witnessing something that should not be possible. Finally, the cult leader spoke, her voice now completely human and filled with something that might have been fear. You're suggesting combat. I'm suggesting science, Sarah corrected. A controlled experiment to determine whether entropy or organization is the more fundamental force. Isn't that what you wanted to prove? The cult leader was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see her considering the implications. If she accepted the challenge, she would be engaging in exactly the kind of organized, purposeful activity that her philosophy claimed was meaningless. If she declined, she would be admitting that her demonstrations of entropy were really just acts of destruction rather than expressions of cosmic truth. Very well, the cult leader said finally. We accept your proposal. But understand, young human, that when entropy encounters true organization, the organization always loses. It is the fundamental law of the universe. Sarah nodded gravely. We'll see. What followed was perhaps the strangest negotiation in galactic history. Instead of discussing territorial rights or resource allocation, the delegates spent the next several hours working out the parameters for a cosmic experiment. The entropy cult would attempt to dissolve a carefully prepared target using their entropic techniques. Human specialists would defend that target using organizational methods. Neutral observers would monitor the results and declare a winner. The crystalline hegemony and void swimmers, relieved to discover that the actual asteroid field was no longer under threat, eagerly agreed to postpone their original dispute until after the experiment was completed. Observer species that had fled the station began returning, drawn by the unprecedented nature of the event that was about to unfold. As the formal agreements were signed and the experiment parameters finalized, Sarah found herself wondering if she had just saved galactic civilization or doomed it to an entirely new kind of conflict. But as she watched the relief and admiration in the eyes of the other delegates, she began to understand something fundamental about humanity's role in the galaxy. Other species feared humans not because they were inherently violent or chaotic, but because they were willing to engage with any challenge, no matter how impossible or dangerous, and find a way to turn it into a problem that could be solved through human methods. The galaxy had learned to give humans the seat of honor not out of respect for their military prowess, but out of gratitude for their willingness to take on the kinds of existential threats that would paralyze any other species. 3 months later, the results of the entropy experiment were broadcast throughout the galaxy. The entropy cult had attempted to dissolve a small moon that human engineers had prepared with organizational patterns based on 3,000 years of military engineering experience. The moon had not only resisted dissolution, but had actually begun imposing order on the entropy field itself, converting chaotic energy into structured matter. Faced with the evidence that their fundamental philosophy was incorrect, the entropy cult underwent what they called a philosophical phase transition. They abandoned their attempts to accelerate universal entropy and instead dedicated themselves to studying the interaction between chaos and order, under the guidance of human scientists who had volunteered to help them understand how organization could emerge from randomness. The asteroid field dispute between the crystalline hegemony and void swimmers was resolved through a joint mining operation that incorporated entropy research stations, creating the first tri-species collaboration in galactic history. And throughout the galaxy, every species that had witnessed the negotiations began to understand something new about humans. They didn't just solve impossible problems by threatening to become monsters. Sometimes they solved impossible problems by refusing to accept that they were impossible in the first place. Sarah returned to Earth as humanity's newest senior diplomat, with a reputation for turning existential crises into scientific collaborations. But more importantly, she finally understood why humans always sat first in council chambers. It wasn't because other species feared them. It was because other species trusted them to be the ones willing to stand up when the universe threw challenges that couldn't be solved through normal means. And in a galaxy full of ancient civilizations, powerful technologies, and cosmic mysteries, that kind of trust was perhaps the most valuable thing any species could possess. The secret behind humans sitting first wasn't about fear or respect or diplomatic protocol. It was about hope. Hope that when the impossible became inevitable, there would be someone stubborn enough to find a way to make it possible after all.